See? You can see him on the live stream. Hello there, comrades. Welcome to the Revolution Report. We're going to live stream this conference that we've had. We've been advertising it on our Telegram channel for a long time, on Twitter, all over social media. We've got tons of people here from around the United States here to listen to our keynote speakers that we have today. We've got Christopher Helali, who's the International Secretary of the American Communist Party. We've got me, the Editor-in-Chief of the Revolution Report, and we've got Al-Din, who is the chairman of ACP as well. We're going to be talking about actually existing socialism, the history of it, how it exists today, because we've been really all over the world and we've seen it with our very own eyes. You're going to hear some really interesting speeches that are eventually also going to be posted in post-production as individual videos on our website as well. So basically everyone's arrived here at the conference. I hope you enjoy, and we're going to get this started.
No, you're on the right track already. Yes,
You're good, bad.
I hope everyone has a room and a place to sit. Welcome in, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the Chicago Workers' School and the Revolution Report event. It's our 5th event of the year, and we're happy to see that more and more people are joining us with each time. And the topic of today is socialism. Does socialism work or not, right? For decades, we've been told that socialism is bad and it doesn't work, and there's lots of problems with it, right? So today we will take a look at other countries in the world, those countries that have tried socialism, and see if it works or not. And our first speaker is the International Secretary of ACP, Christopher Helali. Please welcome Chris.
Thank you so much. First and foremost, a great thank you to Slava and to the entire team of the Revolution Report for putting together this amazing event, for their cooking, for their hospitality. We thank you so much. And thank you to all for coming. I really appreciate such a great turnout. As was mentioned, I'm Christopher Helali, the International Secretary of the American Communist Party. And my job is basically to be the chief diplomat of the party and to go and to make connections with all of the communist and workers' parties around the world, to build bridges between anti-imperialist and multipolar forces, and to continue to live out the internationalist spirit of what it means to be a socialist, a communist, right? But before we get started, I think it's important, that's the teacher in me, of course, asking this next question. What is socialism? I think that a lot of this country is confused about what socialism is. Who can give us a definition of what you think socialism is?
No bedtimes.
No bedtimes? No bedtimes. That's it. Socialism. What do we think? What do we think? Any ideas? What do you think?
Working class seizure of state power.
Working class seizure of state power. Okay. What else?
Bedtime's only for the capitalist class.
Bedtime's only for the capitalists. The proletariat get to have no bedtime. Alright? What else? What else do we think?
It's post-capitalist.
It's post-capitalist. Okay? But what does that mean?
So when the working class have the power.
When the working class has the power, how do we achieve that power? And what power is it?
The have the control of the way of production.
To have control of the means of production. Very good, right? So socialism at its core, at its base, is really about the means of production. It's really about the economy. But we can't be economistic about it. It can't only be the economy. It's also really the creation of a new civilization. It's the creation of an entirely new society. It's the reemergence of what it means to be truly human, right? And that's what many thinkers have thought about over time. That a socialist society would be the complete rejuvenation, sort of the resurrection of what it truly means to be human, what it truly means to be liberated, what it truly means to live in community, to have a society that is fully realized, to actualize its potential, right? And so the question, of course, that posed to us is, have there ever been socialist states? And I think this is a big debate amongst the quote-unquote left, amongst academics and scholars and thinkers, is has there ever been a socialist state? What does socialism look like? Is there a formula for it? Does it have to go along a certain path? And if something deviates from that path, is it not socialist, right? Do we reject it? And I think it's important, being an internationalist, being an international secretary, that I've been able to travel to many quote-unquote socialist states, actually existing socialist states, states that proclaim themselves to be socialist, either in their constitutions or even in their name of their governments, right? Or that they are ruled by socialist, communist, workers' parties, whatever it might be. So of course, the question then that is posed to us is, what does socialism look like in a country, in a group of countries, and on a world scale? Have we ever seen socialism on a world scale?
No.
Not yet. Not yet. We haven't gotten there. But have we seen socialism in countries? And I think that many of us would say yes. I think there might be some divergence about which countries qualify and at what time periods. But I think we can say that there have been socialist countries, that there continue to be socialist countries today, that there continue to be revolutionary movements that aspire to socialism. But then the difference that we have to then sort of tease out is, what does socialism look like in terms of in one country? What does it look like in one country, and what does it look like internationally? How does this tension between the national and the international work itself out? Because regardless of what we might want, we live in nation states. The nation state is a form and a structure that exists. Flags, national symbols bind communities, right? For those who study political theory and political philosophy, you'll know that the big debate amongst nationalist thinkers, on the study of nationalism, is what comes first? The state and then the nation and then the state? Where does it all come from? And actually, it's been uneven. There have been nations that exist that have no state. There are states that have come into existence that have created nations, right? For example, the Soviet people were not a people before 1917. There was no Soviet people. The Soviet people emerged because the state created a whole new identity a whole new national identity for the people. That the people still had their own ethnic background. I'm Russian, I'm Lithuanian, I'm Georgian, but I'm a Soviet citizen, right? That citizenship, that the idea of citizenship within a nation was created by the socialist state to bind different ethnic groups that had their own national aspirations. Bourgeois as they were, right? Reactionary as some of them were. They created a new national identity, right? And we know this to be true because, for example, in Central Europe, the process of the coming together of all the different small states, the sort of principalities that made up what eventually became Prussia and then Germany. There was no unifying German identity from the beginning, but the idea of a Germanic identity coming into the fore in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, 19th century emerging as sort of the binding of all of these different groups together. Outside of Protestantism, Catholicism, what does your prince hold? They were able to, we know, they had multiple options. And eventually, as we know, in 1933 and afterwards, The option that was chosen was a type of national socialism that excluded others who were also within the nation, who also identified as German, but were outside the ethnos of what those in power then said. They are not German. German means this. They're outside of that, and therefore they should be liquidated, they should be expelled, they should not be part of this land, right? So what type of socialism do we mean? We mean a socialism that binds a nation, but that binds a nation with all of the people and all of the diversity there, right? It's not an exclusion. Socialism can't be exclusionary in its form. It can't be exclusionary. It can, of course, have borders, and the state can exclude those who aren't citizens to maintain its national sovereignty and integrity, and its territorial integrity. But it cannot exclude those that are diverse within a socialist state. It in fact embraces the diversity that emerges from those states. And it's a reality, we have to admit. It's a reality that some states today that exist, some nations that exist today, are built upon former empires. It's a reality. We accept it. Whether it's Russia, that had a Russian empire before, that expanded, and that had a chauvinism before the Bolshevik Revolution. Whether it was the United States, that slowly expanded with its idea of manifest destiny, that expanded coast to coast, and also then went on an imperial spree, taking Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Alaska, the Philippines,
Mexico.
on and on. Mexico, of course, the wars with Mexico, right? So, of course, we now inherit this nation. This is the nation that we inherit. We are citizens. My family came in the 60s and 70s to this country. Before that, they were in other countries, right? But this is the nation we have. The flag binds the people. Whether or not some people like to burn the flag here, abroad, is not important. The thing is that it actually binds the people. That the people have a sense of citizenship. That they are all part of a collective process within the nation, right? But that the idea of a nation here, just like the idea of a nation elsewhere, also has its contradictions. What does it mean to be an American, right? Just like the same as what does it now mean to be a Russian? To be a Russian, do you have to be Orthodox? Can you be Muslim, right? Can you be from different minority groups? To be American, do you have to be white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant? They are a minority now in this country, right? But there are still rifts. So the type of socialism that I think the real communists espouse is a type of socialism that binds an entire nation together on a way towards progress and towards building a better future for all of the people. Not excluding people, right? But bringing them all together. We exclude, of course, the capitalist class. But the class is separate than an individual. The individual can be wrenched from their class and brought back into the fold, right? By the seizure of their assets, by the seizure of state power, by the seizure of the industries that they control, that they monopolize, right? I'm not saying that they should be, killed or exiled or things like that. They can come into the fold, right? So I think it's really important to understand here that socialism, for us, is not the type of socialism espoused by those on the far right that are exclusionary about their type of socialism. That want socialism only for one group, at the expense of all other groups. That's not what socialism means. In fact, it's a perversion. They took it from us so that they could manipulate workers who didn't know better into becoming enemies of one another, right? Along racial lines, along religious lines, along even class lines, because they collaborated, right? Different ethnic groups that had capitalists and proletariat, they would collaborate against the other ethnic groups. And it wasn't really class warfare. It became really ethnic warfare or religious warfare, right? And so, of course, in my travels, in my experiences, I have lived in socialist countries. I spent 2 years in China as a China government scholar. I got my master's degree in Marxism from a Chinese university. And I got to experience what the Chinese experience was like. Because the Chinese state was an empire before. But the Chinese experience was that all of us can be fraternal peoples in one nation, right? We're not going to all of a sudden separate Tibet, separate Xinjiang, separate Inner Mongolia, separate Yunnan, separate this, separate that, separate Guangzhou and Guangdong province. No. we can be together. Stronger we are united. And the experience that led them to that conclusion was the experience of colonialism and imperialism. The experience of being carved up slowly by European powers that came and carved out their concessions, carved out Hong Kong, Macau, Wuhan, right? And then stuffed the Chinese people with opium so that they could enrich London and Brussels and Paris and Amsterdam at the expense of the Chinese people. So the Chinese people said, this great experiment, this social experiment that we are going on, it must be a unified experiment. It must be together, and we must liberate one another. So that over 50 ethnic groups within China are united, still with their diversity, but united in a country that values them all as equals, as equal citizens, as equal comrades in a project of socialism, right? Some will look upon a country like the DPRK and say, oh, look, it's only Koreans. But that's the historical reality of the Korean Peninsula. If the Korean Peninsula had been more diverse or with other ethnic groups, they would have been incorporated within the Korean Revolution. Some nations, some socialist states have had much more diversity than others. But that doesn't mean that some states that had less diversity were more pure or more correct. No. In fact, each state has its own characteristics, right? Each state has its own identity. And so with that as the foundation, understanding that as sort of the starting point, then you ask, how do socialist states interact with one another? What is the relationship between one socialist state and another, right? And this was the idea of friendship, of fraternity that was really espoused by the Soviet Union. The friendship of the peoples, the friendship of the nations, right? That now you have socialism, we have socialism, let's come together and build a broader socialism on an international scale. Let's work for peace. Let's work for economic cooperation, right? Does anybody know what Comic-Con was?
It was an economic union of socialist countries.
That's right. It was an economic union of socialist countries, right? It's the precursor to the BRICS, really. It's the socialist form of the BRICS, if you think about it. It was the opportunity for the Soviet Union to build an economic alliance that would enhance all of the socialist states together, right? But of course, with the collapse, with the liquidation of the Soviet Union, a lot of these projects faltered. But the new reality that is emerging now allows us to reclaim these historical institutions and to say the only way to challenge the states that don't want socialism, the states that are antagonistic to socialism, and that of course is the US, EU, NATO bloc, right? The Western hegemonic powers that don't want to see socialism because socialism cuts into their profit margins. The main thing here is that the emergence of multipolarity, the emergence of BRICS, the emergence of the Belt and Road, all of these economic structures, while not fully socialist on paper, do the same thing in practice. They are able to confront imperialism by allowing to develop the economic forces of the states that are resisting imperialist aggression, that are resisting the imposition of imperialist economies and businesses on their nations, the exploitation that they get from having these corporations come and extract. So I think it's important as we embark on this topic, and I'm sure that Don and Haz will be able to go more in depth. But as a baseline, we should understand, we should be united on our definitions and our understandings. Because I think that only from that point can we talk about a similar project and program for building socialism in this country. But I think if we don't have a common language, a common understanding of history, a common understanding of the political and historical legacies of this country, and how we can build socialism in this country, and looking at what other previous parties have done before us, and how previous theorists have thought about this country, then we are lost. Then we won't have any unity to do anything in this country, because the capitalist class in this country is so powerful, dominates in so many fields, that they really hold control over the narrative and the history. As a history teacher, I can tell you, the history books speak nothing about the work of the communists, the work of socialists, and their activism from the 1800s onwards. They don't. Because addressing that history complicates American history, and it complicates the understanding of what it means to be American and what America's vision was supposed to be, I think. The Enlightenment ideals that were at the core of it, where it was supposed to go and where it ended up going. Very divergent path. I think with this understanding, we can embark on this together, and hopefully we can continue to build the way, the structure, the party, the program to really build socialism in the United States. Thank you very much.
Now we have 5 minutes for a break to use the bathroom, have a snack, and then we'll have a next speech.
Ask a question.
Yeah, I know, that's right.
Hi!
What?
Good to see you!
Yeah. The way he started with the
Right. 100%. And how they were kind of like leeching on ours.
right.
I don't even know why I wrote all this.
I thought about it I like it because it's organic. I'm a real fan of the rhetoric.
Just with my job, like, if I can actually memorize things word for word.
I know you can. I saw you do it.
Yeah, like, but for something slow I'm sorry, I'm standing right in front of the camera. It's doing live stream.
Basically says every time I walk.
Hey comrades, hope you're liking it so far. Tristan, can you tweet it out? Okay, yeah, we retweet it.
It's up to you guys.
Can only see the tree and not the woods.
Then whoever wants to answer.
One of my restaurants. More of a younger.
They're more organic.
I think that's great. Yeah, it's great.
The same thing happened to me.
That was okay, good.
I take my passport.
Last time it was like 3-2.
I know, I saw that.
All falling asleep.
I had students, I know, really. It did.
Okay, awesome.
I took a video and I made a clip. Yeah, I'll keep taking it.
Yeah, go ahead. Did you
Chicago? I know you are, right?
I'll try to make it as good as I used to be.
I have to do it again, it's fine.
Right.
The way you
Yeah, oh yeah.
We'll be back in just a couple minutes, comrades.
How many viewers is that?
Right now we've got 87 live viewers.
But I hope later she hears you sing.
Sing and dance. There you go.
I was like you, I had like good mentors one of them, this guy, more so this guy is Alex. Oh yeah, that He'll probably run an ACT event.
At the end. We're all three of us, yep.
Because he's doing really serious stuff. But yeah, he's really excited.
Let's share the link.
We watched that video like 4 times.
Really?
It's so good. It's so
My first
Quick. What it's broadcasting through that. So like, look. Yeah, like that. Good. Yeah, we can do that too.
This girl who's been coming over freaked out, quit the organization, said she wouldn't go to anything, even
That's better.
talking to someone.
That's when I realized
They do everything in one group chat.
Okay, everyone, let's continue. Our next speaker recently visited GPRK, also known in the world as the North Korea. He also been to other socialist countries of the world, and he will talk about his experience there. If you have any questions, please reserve them for the end. After all of the speakers are done, then you'll be able to ask your questions. Okay, so please welcome our next speaker, the Editor-in-Chief of the Revolution Report, Donald Corder.
Working? Yeah. All right, comrades, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for coming out to this conference. I mean, it's so great to see so many returning faces, so many new faces interested in the work we're doing. I started the Revolution Report by myself, like back in 2018 when I moved to Russia, and I thought I could give people a new perspective on world events, on communism, the former Soviet world, and Russia in the modern context as well. And it's so great to see that go from just one person to a whole team of people, and tons of people coming to these conferences and collaborating with the American Communist Party, Haas, Chris Helali, great speech by the way, I really liked it. So again, before I start my speech, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for showing up. We really enjoy just being able to interact with you on that level. And to start my speech, I've got two questions. First of all, are there any botanists or people who are involved in agriculture here? I know you. Okay, good. Nobody else. Chris, don't answer this question. Okay. Would anyone like to tell me what the color of a nice ripe tomato is? Any hands? Yes.
Red.
Any other answers? Yeah. Oh. That's not fair. She's the daughter of a botanist. Well, anyway, the hook was going to be everyone's going to say red, and then obviously I was going to be like, well, actually there are black tomatoes in the world. Because most Americans don't know that, but that's okay. Most people don't know, obviously, and we all know this, that there are black tomatoes in the world, really. And actually, pretty much all of them originate from Crimea and Siberia. There are even tomatoes that are red and black. One of them is actually named the Paul Robeson tomato. It was it was started in the Soviet Union in honor of this great figure of our movement, Paul Robeson. I mean, the guy who sang the Soviet national anthem in English so that people could understand the meaning behind this great creation of human culture, really, which is the Soviet anthem. Obviously nowadays, unfortunately, he's kind of whitewashed into a liberal, but for us, everyone knows him. I mean, he's a big icon for us. But, you know, for everyday Americans, they don't know that. And, I mean, why would they, really? Why would they think about the fact that there are black tomatoes in the world, or red and black tomatoes, if there's basically none of them in the United States? Of course, with the exception of people who are into agriculture, they're botanists, they have a garden, and they are like specialists in gardening, right? They wouldn't know about that. Even though all that information is actually available on the internet. You could look it up and look up black tomatoes, the Paul Robeson tomato, all these different... There's tons of tomatoes in the world. There's orange tomatoes, there's green tomatoes, all different types of tomatoes, and all that information is on the internet, and yet so few people in the United States know about it. And the reason for that, obviously, is that the primary tomato that people consume in the United States is red. Well, where am I going with this, right? This is something connected to what I call the defector's fallacy, because the same logic of these tomatoes actually applies to the way Americans perceive the socialist world. Because why would someone defect from a socialist country? Why would someone living in a socialist country move to the United States, for example? Obviously we could talk about the West, but let's talk about the United States right now. Because they have some sort of problem with socialism. They don't want to live there, right? So obviously the only people as a whole that we're going to run into in the United States from countries like the Soviet Union, from China, from the DPRK, they're going to give you one perspective on what life is like in socialist countries. And it's almost always going to be negative. I mean, we've all heard these slogans, you know, these things that have become cliches, essentially. Like, communism only works on paper, there's no freedom in communist countries, if you like communism so much, why don't you go move to a communist country? And the funny thing about that is actually, that last one is very particularly important, because that one I heard a lot when I was living in the United States. When I had already become a communist, and I was looking to better understand what the society is all about. And so I kind of took that advice. I mean, I didn't move, of course Russia's not a communist country, but it is the inheritor of the legacy of the Soviet Union. This is the first workers' state on a national level that's ever existed in all of history. And even though that Russia's not communist anymore, the Soviet legacy, everything that was built in the Soviet Union, the Soviet mentality, all of this stuff still holds over into Russia today. And a lot of what was written in the Soviet Union about socialism, treasure troves of knowledge in books, in articles, in videos, that stuff is just like 90% not even available in English. So the irony of that, right, is that if you want to actually really understand what communism is really about, I would say that really probably the best way is to actually go to the communist country and immerse yourself there. And I could pretty much guarantee you that you'll have the opposite impression from what these people who use these cliches actually are trying to suggest to you. You'll actually understand socialism a lot better, and you'll understand it from a positive perspective, because I'll actually tell you, I mean, the vast majority of people who actually live under socialism and have lived under socialism stayed there. The defectors who left are in a very small minority. And there, of course, are exceptions to the defectors fallacy, as I'm describing it. And this goes into another interesting point. There are some exceptions, but these exceptions are sort of rendered inert by a number of other factors that contribute to the way most people view socialism in the United States, right? We've got the corporate media, which is owned by corporations. I work in media, so like, if there's anything I understand, it's media. And the privately owned media is just completely run by corporations that own them, that pay their bills, and what they say is part of a carefully constructed narrative that is purely aimed to appease the people who are giving the money. It's not exactly to show people the truth. It's not to give people information to make their lives better. It's essentially to put forward a narrative that's that the corporations that own them are happy with. It's the same with politics as well. I mean, you've got the two-party system that's completely owned by corporations that pay the bills of the parties, right? We've got elections that take place before the primaries even take place, called money elections. Many people don't know about that either, where all the potential candidates get into a room with the funders of the party, and which are obviously all big corporations, representatives of them, and they say, how are you going to represent our interests? And the candidates that prove that they can represent the interests of these large corporations are the ones that get the funding and show up on the ballot. But back to the defectors fallacy. There are exceptions, of course, that are drowned out by all this. And there's also something to learn about the exceptions as well. I'll tell you an interesting story. I was born in East Brunswick, New Jersey. And in this town, we had actually a small population of people who left the Soviet Union and left Russia. And I got to tell you, actually, the majority of people in that community in my hometown actually left after the fall of the Soviet Union. And they had actually only good things to say about the Soviet Union. That's the ultimate irony. And when people, they were kind of pressured not to talk about it. I mean, they told me because I was interested. I was trying to pry information out of them, But in normal society, they just understand that most people are just not going to listen to that. And they had good things to say about the Soviet Union. The reason for them moving to the United States is because socialism collapsed, because capitalism replaced socialism in Russia. And what it gave birth to was a society where criminals, bandits, foreign vulture capitalists, everyone who essentially had the opposite interests of the vast majority of the population were allowed to do whatever they want. They speculated on everything that was built in the Soviet Union in terms of factories, in terms of infrastructure. All this stuff was dismantled and sold for pennies of its worth abroad. Criminals obviously had their way in the country. It was a horrible period that basically nobody in Russia looks upon fondly. That's capitalism and democracy in Russia, as the West likes it, right? The West says the 1990s was great because Russia didn't offer any opposition to the American capitalists going in there and basically exploiting the resources of the country, exploiting everything that the Soviet Union had built. It was essentially a colonial project. And what's more interesting is that there are actually statistics that make this exception to the defectors rule very, very interesting. And I found this information. It's according to a 1996 report from an anti-Russian, anti-Soviet think tank called the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. And it said that the volume of specialists leaving Russia after the fall of the USSR, so we're talking about scientists and engineers, it was significantly higher than during any other period of Soviet socialism. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the volume of specialists leaving Russia to the United States during that period was higher than the volume of any other period in the Soviet Union. And we also have to understand that throughout the entire Soviet Union, the demographic of the country that was most likely to leave were specialists. They were not ordinary workers. So this simple fact implies that the total exodus of people from Russia, from this former Soviet sphere, was actually greater once capitalism came to this region than under any period of socialism. So obviously that doesn't add up here at all. I mean, something about the narrative that we're taught doesn't add up at all. I mean, because these, and this is even comparing right to the late Soviet period, where the Soviet Union was apparently in stagnation. So less people were leaving the so-called hellhole, stagnant Soviet Union than they were in the 1990s when everything was supposed to be capitalist and democratic. But again, these are exceptions. They're not the rule. And like I said, they're pretty much drowned out by all of those other factors I mentioned before. The corporate media, there's also something I didn't mention, the state-funded NGOs like USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, who literally covertly fund operations in these countries where they want to change the narrative. Money spent by the State Department through organizations that are supposed to be NGOs. And the operations that they conduct in countries where we see this sort of outflow of people in the former Soviet sphere is all about education. It's about encouraging the arts, encouraging sports. That's what they say in all these places. But in reality, they're actually using these as vehicles to spread propaganda to lead to a color revolution. I mean, that's what we saw in Ukraine. Ukraine had, immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union, billions of US taxpayer dollars put into that country through NGOs to essentially brainwash people. In Georgia, the same thing is going on. I don't know if you guys have been following the news, but they've had various rounds of violent, politically motivated riots over a law that would just add some transparency to these NGOs that are funded by the West, and they're trying to start a color revolution in the country. The government's not even trying to exterminate them. They're just trying to make these organizations declare the source of their income. And violent protests, people throwing Molotov cocktails, mobilized by these Western-funded NGOs. I was even there myself when this was happening. It was crazy. And they didn't even let me back into the country the second time it came around, because the government bureaucracy is actually filled with these liberals, these pro-Western liberals that have been educated by these NGOs. An entire generation has been risen that fills the government bureaucracy now from these from this State Department funded elements in society. And what's interesting enough is that they are in direct confrontation with the parliament of the country, which is actually elected by people. So the majority of the people in the country are still actually voting for people that are against these NGOs. But that's a whole different topic that we could talk a little bit about in the Q&A, of course, if you guys are interested in that. But so I want to go into a little bit about my experiences that I've seen firsthand now. For any of you that might not know me that well, I'm a journalist and I've traveled around the entire world, essentially. Just not Latin America. I really want to go there. But I've been to Africa, I've been to Southeast Asia, Europe, former Soviet sphere. All these places are just, they're really beautiful, first of all. The world that we live in is so diverse in terms of pretty much everything. From, you know, the deserts of Africa and the jungles in the southern half and the lush mountains of Far East Asia. I mean, there's so much that our world has that is really, really beautiful. And I've run into so many diverse cultures, so many diverse religions, diverse mindsets, so many different types of people all around the world. And yet, you know what the interesting thing is? Pretty much all around the world, people want the same thing. No matter how different their cultures are, no matter how different they might seem to one another. But they essentially want the same thing. They want security for their families. They want to know that their lives are not going to be turned upside down by a crazy war or a government being overthrown by some foreign power. They want to know that they can sustain themselves for the rest of their lives and make sure that their family is prosperous and that they don't have to worry, you know. Please excuse me for citing a bourgeois politician, but I thought that Franklin Delano Roosevelt pretty well described it in his Four Freedoms speech in 1941. He said that people all over the world want basically freedom of religion, freedom of expression, or freedom of worship, he says. Freedom of worship, freedom of expression, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And I think this is a really good general description of what I've seen in my travels throughout the world, I mean, of what people want. But the irony of a capitalist president saying that is that all of these countries that we accuse of being totalitarian and authoritarian and being hellholes and oppressing people, I'm talking specifically about socialist countries, their entire government policy has been to achieve these freedoms for their people. They've done literally everything to achieve these freedoms for their people. And of course, where they've fallen short has been the result of them also having to put up with constantly being harassed by colonialism and imperialism in countries and governments like our own, unfortunately. And I could tell you a little bit about my travels. Of course, we could talk about a lot more of it during the Q&A section. But I've been to Vietnam, for example, and it was amazing to see, you know, a prosperous country that just several decades ago was embroiled in a life or death struggle against imperialism, not against one empire but two. They fought the French, kicked them out. And then our government sent our own people there to commit war crimes, terrible war crimes against civilians. I mean, there's so much documented evidence of horrific things that we did there just to contain communism. I mean, the one that comes to mind first is the My Lai massacre. If you don't know what that is, you could look it up on the internet. Horrible, absolutely horrible. And now this country, just decades later, after socialism was victorious in this struggle, is one of the most prosperous economies in Southeast Asia and Asia in general. I mean, I also found this statistic. Actually, I didn't even know this, but during the COVID pandemic, when lockdowns were going on and everything, and it was affecting the economies all over the world, Vietnam actually was Asia's top performing economy in 2020. Top performing economy, a country that, like I said, just not even half a century ago was fighting a life and death struggle against imperialism. That is obviously an achievement of socialism, if there ever was one. I've been to the DPRK. I was there recently in North Korea, just several months ago actually. I went with the Russian delegation, with Vladimir Putin, to this very high-level meeting that he had with Kim Jong-un. They signed a strategic partnership, and I got to say, I saw some stuff that even as someone who understands that Western propaganda about North Korea is nonsense, it even surprised me. I mean, Pyongyang has modern apartment buildings springing up all around the capital of this country that is apparently a hellhole. right? Modern apartment buildings that are offered free of charge to its people. Free of charge. And you got to pay utilities. And that's like 3% of people's salaries, like between 3 to 5% of their salaries. But aside from that, entirely free of charge. And I see these buildings when I'm there, and I'm just like, I cannot believe, as someone who is from New Jersey, right? If anyone, I don't know how many people know how dilapidated infrastructure is there, and how expensive it's become, and how people have to work paycheck to paycheck to live in essentially a shithole in a lot of places just to pay the rent. And in North Korea, they're giving modern apartment complexes away for free to the people. This is just the tip of the iceberg, even. I mean, there's also something to be said about the fact that North Korea's GDP is about the same as Sudan. Do you guys know that? Sudan. That's a very poor country. And yet, the life expectancy of this country is higher than certain states in the United States. Missouri and Louisiana have a lower life expectancy than North Korea. And the life expectancy in North Korea is actually comparable to many countries that are labeled by the World Bank as high income. Poland, for example. Around 74 years is the life expectancy in both Poland and North Korea. And yet North Korea has a GDP comparable to that of Sudan. How is that possible? The socialized medicine system. The system of preventative care, not making profit off of people's illnesses, but actually preventing them. Seeing illness as a bad thing. Seeing illness as something that's going to cost the government money. Instead of seeing it as something that could make insurance companies money. Insurance companies that are not even involved in the medical process. So, and that's not even to mention, of course, I mean, we talked about how Vietnam was fighting a life and death struggle against imperialism just several decades ago. I mean, what about North Korea? That was like on the same level, if not worse. I mean, Douglas MacArthur literally wanted to drop atomic bombs on North Korea because he was so tired of using napalm and killing civilians and killing civilians and killing civilians and not being able to break the Korean spirit. That's insane, you know? And another thing I even forgot to mention, I had it written here, but DPRK has a space program. They've successfully launched a satellite into space. And they, again, a GDP comparable to that of Sudan. I mean, that is just, it's against all odds achieved such things that are considered to be completely unachievable for countries of the same economic level as North Korea, you know. Now here's another country I've been to, Belarus. A lot of people don't really think about Belarus when you think about socialism or anything like that, but Belarus is a country that was not even privatized after the fall of the Soviet Union. Belarus actually, after the fall of the Soviet Union, said we're going to continue our central planning and we're not going to privatize our economy. And to this day, they have essentially a strong centrally planned economy which relies heavily on regulated markets. And it's achieved great things. I mean, in the 1990s, there was none of this stuff that we saw that I mentioned earlier in Russia, and that took place in other places of the former Soviet Union as well. And because of that, Belarus has the lowest economic inequality in all of Europe. It's got an enormous human development index, very high. Its poverty is super low. I mean, this is a country that has achieved a lot for its people. And at the same time, get this, the agricultural system of Belarus is actually pretty much like the Soviet agricultural system. They still have collective farms. They still have state-owned farms. And they produce over half of the country's agricultural product, which, by the way, is self-sufficient. Belarus has become self-sufficient agriculturally on a Soviet agricultural system that it was able to modernize and equip with up-to-date technology so that they have actually become an exporter of food. And I've traveled all around Belarus, I have to say. They have also a very organic and clean agricultural system as well. They use, the vast majority of fertilizers they use are completely organic. In Belarus, I had the most delicious chicken cutlets and mashed potatoes I have ever had in my life. And you know, you think it's such a simple thing, you know, to think about, but those elements of society really make a big difference. And this is actually what the Soviet Union was trying to strive for. I mean, obviously the Soviet agricultural system ran into its own problems towards the late Soviet period, but Belarus continued the Soviet legacy, and now it stands as literally a socialist country. This is something that a lot of people don't talk about, but I think it's definitely something that should be talked about. China is another one, of course. Chris already mentioned he's been to China. He's been there for 2 years. I've been there many times. I've been to Beijing, Shanghai, Dalian, and these cities look like they're from the future. I mean, like they're really, again, it was another example of where I was aware of Western propaganda about this country, and yet I was still surprised at how they are light years ahead of the West in so many things, right? I mean, they've got an enormous network of high-speed rails that have been developed by the state, and yet they're profitable too. They're making profits for the state, and yet they're low cost to the people who live there, and they're much more efficient in pretty much every way than the system we have in the United States, that is based obviously on vehicle ownership, on promoting capitalist consumption of cars and everything like that. But in China they have advanced public transport systems that are built in a modern way, and they're built for ordinary people to use, not so that people can just make money, right? The state makes money off of it and then recycles it into the same programs that they've used to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Over the past 40 years, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you know this statistic, but 700 million people have been lifted out of extreme poverty in China over the last 40 years. 700 million people. It's a country that has advanced light years faster than people can even react. You can even notice that when you go to China, places like Beijing and Shanghai, that people still kind of, there's a lot of people there that still kind of have like a village mentality. They're, like, so many people have moved there and their families have been lifted out of extreme poverty, either in their generation or the last generation, that they're not even considered really like urban people yet. And that is really crazy. That's something that I also noticed when I was there. And I think this quote by Lenin really is applicable to this. That he said that there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. And with the socialist system, what we've seen actually take place in these socialist countries that, according to Western propaganda, are hellholes. I mean, they've achieved this. They've achieved massive industrialization, infrastructure development, and extermination of poverty for the benefits of their people, right? Over a very, very short amount of time. And I'm only scratching the surface with this stuff. Like, please, guys, after we have the panel, ask me questions about this stuff. If you have any questions, I can try to answer them based on my first-hand experience. But I think the main takeaway from all this, right? Because we could study socialist countries, we can go to these other socialist countries and see how they live and everything, but that's not the end of that's not the end. That's a means to the end. Because we don't live in China, we don't live in the DPRK, we don't live in Vietnam, we live in America. And the means of understanding these countries are to allow us the end of building socialism in our own country, because we can do it. We've got so many people in this country, hundreds of millions of people, with untapped creative potential because of the conditions that they're forced to live in under capitalism, because they're forced to live paycheck to paycheck, because they're forced to not think about what they really want to do in their life, how they want to actually make a difference in the world, but they're stuck thinking their entire lives either about paying rent or other expenses that are connected to their everyday lives, or let's say they're not paycheck to paycheck, they make a little bit more money. The idea is the same. They're trying to they're trying to save for retirement. And that's all they can think about. That's all most people can think about as a result of this capitalist system where you don't know if tomorrow is guaranteed. And imagine how much creative potential can be unleashed if people didn't have to worry about that. If people took what they do in their free time and they used that energy to contribute something great to society. Right? If people could get educated without having to worry about being in debt all their lives, or getting health care without being in debt all their lives, getting health care that doesn't cost an arm and a leg. The US has the most expensive health care in the world, and it's very, very far from being the best. There's literally no reason for that except to make money for capitalists. And we have the ability to change that through the American Communist Party, through organizing, through building our communities and building connections with them to build a better tomorrow, a future in which future generations are going to read about it in the history textbooks, and they're going to be thankful to us that we were responsible for allowing them that future, that otherwise they would be living in what we're living in pretty much right now. So yeah, on that note, Haas is going to, after a short break, I guess, take on how we're going to organize for that. And yeah, thank you.
Yes. No, I need to go. We have 5 minutes, let's go.
Way to go, brother.
Yeah, thanks.
My dad, who's not the smartest person, said that 50% of young people in Russia want to leave. I know that's not true.
Yeah, actually, when the military operation started,
No.
when the military
Like all the different communist nationalists. But like my dad's pretty already 19, 50% of Russians like to be 19.
I know, right?
Some they wanted to leave, but that's not true, right? And like before the war.
You think communists are like blue hair, pink hair?
My dad's like, you don't think that's true, right?
Yeah, especially the ones that like work to payroll. Oh no, it's okay. I
But that's not, you know, the reason why no, he said that 20%, like 50%, he's gonna laugh back off that.
Hold on 1 second, let me take this. Okay, so
think so. That's much. I love it. Oh, did you make the bucket? Yeah, I'm gonna love it. You're gonna have to. Where's Kyle at? See this guy? Yeah.
Wait,
he stays out there.
don't want this to happen. I don't want this to
That war would just end in destruction, and then both sides would break their rules. That would be very horrible.
Yeah. Do you think it's going to happen? Yeah, good.
I'm actually a firm believer of mutually assured destruction. I think both sides understand that ending nuclear weapons is not possible.
But a nuclear war won't happen.
It's a very intense process.
And do you think Russia will take all of Ukraine soon?
To be honest, I really don't know. Well, their goal is not to take all of Ukraine.
But do you think they could?
They could, yeah. Can you imagine? You know why Russia is going to take Ukraine? First of all, West Ukraine is not Russian. It's a different people. But East Ukraine is Russia.
Yeah, but do you think they're going to take Odessa?
Well, I think they would like to. Yeah, sorry. Just because
So our first two speakers were talking about socialism in other countries and experience visiting those countries. Now it's time to talk about socialism in our country. And for that, please welcome Helali.
I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. We've had great speeches by the previous two speakers, Chris and Don. Very illuminating speeches about the international experience of socialism and also historically. But as Americans, the elephant in the room is, what does that all mean here? What are the implications of the historical experience of socialism in this country, the most anti-communist country on earth? And what do I mean by that to qualify? Well, there's a few things. Firstly, this is the country that by far, in terms of its government, has committed the most amount of resources, the most amount of effort to destroy socialist experiments and projects around the world. Secondly, we have another problem on our hands. And besides the Cold War propaganda and the deeply ingrained anti-communism we're so often told about among the American people, we have the problem of the fact that this is a very individualistic country. This is a country which lacks the kind of implicit bonds of social association which are unspoken, which most other countries, whether they're socialist or not in name, do actually have on a cultural level. As a matter of fact, when we think of the implementation of socialism in this country, we can't help but think of cults. Because as a matter of fact, socialism has a long history in the United States, even before the establishment of the United States. In America, the first settlers and the pilgrims constituted and established what you could call socialistic societies, where things were owned in common. You have the historical experience of the Shakers and other religious groups which lived according directly to the Bible in a communistic fashion. They didn't own anything. Everything was owned in common. But what do we see time and time again? We see the horizon of the frontier providing an escape hatch for any individual who so deigns to betray this community, to betray their people. We see cult leaders selling out their membership, scamming them. We can't distinguish in America an authentic community being created from a kind of Ponzi scheme and a cult. We've all become cynical because every form of collective existence that gets constituted in this country is used as a mechanism and a weapon to exploit Americans. That's precisely how Americans are exploited. They lack any kind of social connection. They lack any kind of community. And this is a very lucrative kind of reality that capitalists can exploit, right? They can provide people the sense of a community and identity and a belonging, while in fact pursuing pure, private, individual gain. So when we ask the question of if socialism works, we have to think about from where is this question being, from what place is this question being posed? Does it work in the sense of if we had a vacuum, which was devoid of the baggage of the past and all the kinds of impurities that might infect such an experiment, would it work? Is it something we can just test like a computer program or something along those lines? But actually, this type of thinking, which places the burden on us to answer the question of whether a new type of society is possible or a new community is possible or a new kind of cult on a farmstead somewhere is possible, is a wrong way of understanding the significance of socialism. To be clear, it's been made clear by Marx and Engels throughout the entirety of their works that by default, man, as an attribute of his being, exists socially. Even in a capitalist society, the means by which we survive and we exist is through our social relationships. And so capitalism accentuates this contradiction, which Engels laid out directly in Utopian and Scientific, between the socially produced wealth and its private appropriation. So by default, we have a social existence, and private property, even before capitalism, whether feudalism or slave society, consists in a type of violent abstraction from this. So the history of private property is the history of alienation. It's the history of the destruction of social relationships and forms of social existence. That's precisely what Marx was talking about when he speaks of alienation. He wasn't just talking about primitive communism as some Edenic state, a pure state that got, corrupted by the rise of civilization. He was talking about the history and development of private property in terms of the history of the usurpation and the dissolution of experienced organic social bonds. But it's a double-edged sword, because simultaneously and corresponding with this alienation also comes the ability to, so to speak, think outside of the box. The ability to disrupt the kind of stupid conventions humanity finds itself in as far as its relationship with nature is concerned. So this same alienation is what produces modern industry and modern science, the ability to step outside the bounds of an established form of social existence, and corresponded to the ability to have new forms of experimentation in terms of what is possible as far as our relationship with nature is concerned, and even with one and another. This is why Marxism regards capitalism as historically progressive. It's not because Marxism associates progress with, rainbows and flowers and sunshine. It was a very ugly, violent, and hideous process. Marx talks about it in Capital, the rise of primitive accumulation. The so-called rosy dawn of capitalism was marked by what? Genocide, looting, devastation, all manner of corruption and immorality and so on that you can expect. But this is also what has participated in the rise of an unprecedented expansion of the productive forces and development of the productive forces. So that there is such a thing as socialism, it should confront us as an interesting and strange, from a historical perspective, fact. Only when the fundamental social attribute of man's existence is called into question in some kind of way can socialism arise, even as a word. We have a word for socialism only because there's something about the nature of modern industrial capitalism that has destroyed and devastated our fundamental and implicit and unspoken sociality. So this is why I've kind of been embroiled in some trouble in the past when I said, these forms of Asian societies before capitalism, that was already socialism. Well, what did I mean by that precisely? I meant it in the sense that the burden is not us. There's no extraordinary burden that should be placed on socialists in terms of having to prove socialism works. In a sense, socialism is the default and implicit existence of mankind since the beginning of time, right? It's capitalism that has to prove its existence through this kind of violent abstraction, regular and cyclical kind of abstraction, an immense degree of effort has to go in actually breaking up the kind of implicit bonds of community and association, even within capitalist society itself. For example, following FDR's New Deal in the 1930s, Americans had a kind of sense of culture and traditional form of existence. And with the onset of neoliberalism, even this existence, which was born from a capitalist society, has to be what Deleuze calls deterritorialized, right? Even this has to be overthrown. And it's in America specifically where this process seems to be without end. Every attempt we as Americans make to establish some kind of community, some kind of social existence, is just setting itself up to be basically broken up and destroyed. Now, this is why it's important to understand the unique significance of Marxism. Marx and Engels were not the first or even the most significant historically theorists of socialism. This isn't true. Marx and Engels did not regard socialism itself with any degree of extraordinary significance in terms of like this is a new, completely novel, groundbreaking thing. No. There were many socialist theorists. There were many socialistic kinds of thinkers. Engels very, very casually refers to these kinds of early experimental religious communities in the United States as socialistic and even communistic. This was not, now if you use these words loosely, you get crucified. You're saying this is socialism, this is not true socialism. And then you have the Trotskyites or you have other kinds of leftists, I don't know. Oh, Stalin, Soviet Union, it's not true socialism. They still had commodity production. China today can't possibly be socialist because they're treating socialism as a kind of receptacle for the amelioration and solving of all possible problems and injustices on Earth instead of an objective fact of man's existence. But what characterized the unique nature of Marxism and Marx's discovery was not establishing these pure parameters and definitions of what's true socialism or true communism. It's scientific socialism. It's the ability to know and have scientific knowledge of these already existing, objectively existing, social laws and historical laws of mankind's existence. When we become aware of our sociality, which is already here, we don't need to create it, it's already there, that in and of itself is the beginning of socialistic consciousness, of proletarian consciousness, right? Just being aware, for example, of the class struggle, that's the beginning of proletarian consciousness. It's not the proposition for a completely new kind of utopia, the Big Rock Candy Mountain or something. It's just a kind of insistence upon the ability for us to know and be aware of what we have already created in our existence here and now, which is a social existence. And when that awareness and when that knowledge is elevated to the status of an authority, when it's elevated to the status of a political authority and a cause to insist upon, not simply a passive form of knowledge that's purely descriptive, but one that informs and serves as the basis of our relationship to our society, to our communities, to our reality, and to our history, then we're talking about the onset of the real proletarian class struggle, the real communist struggle that is of legend and of myth at this point, the one we know about from actual history. Communism did not begin when some individuals said, I have an idea for a better society, I'm so smart, I'm just going to propose this and fight for it. No. Communists, all they did was insist upon the truth of what was going on here and now, of insisting upon the truth of the society they lived in now. It's the insistence upon the knowledge they derived from this truth that gave weight and authority and legitimacy and credibility to the cause of communism. All you have to do is communicate to people the truth of what is going on, to paraphrase Rosa Luxemburg. And that is an extremely radical insight as far as the American socialist tradition is concerned that exists now. People, whether on the right or the so-called left, I don't think it's a real left, but whatever, they have this idea that the burden is on us to basically invent a new society. That's not true. The burden is on us to be honest about the society we live in now. The burden is on us to be responsible for that society, to be accountable for it. And that's exactly what's lacking in this country. We already have a social existence of some kind, although in the American context, it's rather peculiar. It's rather peculiar because this social existence seems to be defined, in contrast to other kinds of countries who had a deeply rooted pattern of social existence that preceded even modern capitalism. The one we've produced here seems to be a little bit mysterious. It seems to be characterized by the scars of genocide, for example, by the scars of a history of alienation, of bloodshed, of not even just that, of robbing the people of this country themselves, constantly evicting them from their land, constantly bankrupting them, constantly disrupting and disturbing every established form of social existence. What form of civilization is that? What form of sociality is that? Well, it's a double-edged sword. Because on the one hand, one of the things that can characterize America is what I just mentioned, right? The profound alienation and individualism that disrupts every kind of attempt to establish a social existence. But on the other hand, there's that American experimentation that we seem to think is unique to, at least in the 20th century. Maybe now things are changing, but there is something about the American spirit which can be characterized by taking initiatives without asking anyone. You know, experimenting and doing things in unprecedented ways without anyone's permission. And I think this is something that actually can be integrated in a rational social existence, so long as we become aware of its significance. With the rise and the onset of super-imperialism, as Michael Hudson would describe it, America today has centralized the accumulation of the surpluses produced by almost every country on planet Earth. And this is what sustains, it seems like, our economic existence increasingly, rather than any kind of domestic form of production and manufacturing and so on and so on. With that more or less robbery of the entire planet, we have also established a type of contact with the cultures and civilizations and histories of the entire world. And this is the burden that rests upon our shoulders, today as socialists. The burden that rests upon our shoulders is to be worthy of the histories and civilizations of the countries of mankind, which we've and civilizations which we've assimilated into this singular world system. What about American history? What is our contribution to that? Where will American history begin? Is it simply Europe? Is it a combination of Europe and Asia? Is it something native to here? Well, the truth is it's going to have to be all of them. And what will it mean for us to possess insight into that history and to insist upon that insight in a practical political way? Well, only one thing we can be certain of. It's a declaration of war to even recognize it. It's a declaration of war to even insist upon it. Because if we live in a country characterized by the forceful expropriation of socially produced wealth, whether internationally or domestically, that key word of force is also probably going to have to characterize how socialism is going to be victorious in this country as well. It's going to be an act of war against the ruling class. It's going to be an act of war against the rulers of America and the American empire, which is, of course, responsible for the genocide and devastation and destruction of peoples around the world, as well as their histories and civilizations and so on and so on. And when we think about exactly what it means to insist upon socialism in this country, the thing that's most important to bear in mind is that the very purport of a United States of America, there's something you could ambiguously identify as inherently socialist already about that. It's the purport of a united and therefore collective type of existence whose content is unspecified and undefined. it can only impress itself upon us as an article of faith. Faith and trust. Faith and trust that we can build a form of social existence and a type of community without the fear that is always in the back of our minds that somebody is just going to run away with their tail between their legs and rob us high and dry. Someone's going to scam us, or is a favorite nowadays of American popular culture, there's going to be a kind of dystopian George Orwell 1984. All of this lacks, to paraphrase Fred Hampton, in a mistrust of oneself. Right? It's a mistrust of one's own existence, which is a social existence. It's a profound alienation toward that characterizes American anti-communism. We're scared to reap the consequences of our own existence. And why shouldn't we be? We look at American history, civilizationally speaking, and it's not exactly the prettiest. We're scared for the reckoning that's in store for us when we finally take responsibility and accountability for that and insist upon that as forming the basis and the history of a new civilization. And what else can I call it? The American civilization is very new. China, for example, is a civilization with thousands of years of history. Russia as a civilization is at least a millennia old. All of the civilizations in which socialism has been victorious around the world were civilizations that already had a precedent of definite patterns of social existence. We don't have that. We don't have that benefit. The very emergence of this country as a civilization that can coexist with the civilizations of the world is synonymous with the victory of socialism and of communism. There's no other way around it. There's no other way we can establish ourselves as one people in one country amidst others around the world without taking responsibility for the fundamental factors by which we can produce ourselves. To insist upon our geography, upon our land, upon our wealth, upon our resources, and to insist upon that as the square one of an American socialism, rather than the global system of appropriating and robbing the wealth of the world. Well, think about the implications of what that is. Think about the implications of how socialism could only ever arise in this country almost as a kind of Bronze Age conquest. Why? Because we're going to have to seize our land. We're going to have to seize our resources, our factories, and our means of production. We're going to have to take them and use this as the foundation for a completely new form of production. And that in itself is a radical form of alienation and separation from the global system upon which we as Americans now subsist. And I see no way around it. But thankfully speaking, I think that history itself, if there's any meaning to it, has shown that when it appears that we have gotten ourselves in a kind of existential situation in which it almost seems like a comedy in terms of how meaningless it may end up being. I mean, is America, is this just a completely meaningless, horrific Frankenstein accident of history which will culminate and end in nothing? Well, never in history has a people culminated in nothing. Even in the stories of a Bible of a people being completely wiped out and eradicated from existence, even these stories have a lesson. Even they have a meaning behind them. To be communists in this country, at the risk of sounding idealistic, we have to have faith that at the end of this process, something meaningful, something human will arise at the end of the tunnel. We have to unconditionally have that faith, because if we don't have faith in our humanity. And how can we have confidence, the bare minimum of confidence in our humanity, if we don't have that? How could we have honor in terms of defining the means by which we engage in relationships toward other human beings, if we don't have a fundamental faith that all of this collective and social existence we have, for better or worse, have produced, will end in something meaningful? On that note, I'd like to conclude.
Is that projected, I think?
Oh yeah, we'll project.
Yeah, we'll project.
Well, Slava, maybe you could call on people and then they can address their question to whoever.
Sure. Eddie?
So I wanted to ask a question about chapter 26 of Capital on primitive accumulation during Chris's talk, and then Haas actually happened to bring it up in his, which is perfect. But could you guys expand a little bit on that chapter and what it's about? Because it's a very special and short chapter of Volume 1 where Marx, it's like 2.5 pages, and it doesn't necessarily flow with the rest of the book, but he's laying out basically how class societies are created through the expropriation of land and whatnot. So could you expand on that chapter a little bit more?
You want me to begin?
Either one.
Yeah, well, I think this is a kind of ironical, it's an example of Marx's kind of ironical writing style, and you need to understand the context, which is that some classical, there was a kind of a prejudice that was lurking in classical political economy, which was searching for the fundamental foundation and the basis of what we call the kind of voluntaristic market relationships of capitalism, right? You have individualistic liberal thinkers like Locke attempting to, this notion of social contracts and kind of, first you establish the sovereignty of the individual, and then on the basis of this are relationships based on pure exchange, voluntaristically possible. But what Marx is trying to speak to is that at the foundation of capitalism is a profound, actually, social violence, right? Or we should call it an anti-social violence, right? Where actually primitive accumulation, it depicts a picture which is the opposite of the kind of, Adam Smith free market of voluntary relationship. It's people aggregated, their labor aggregated after divorcing the means of production from them in these kinds of, well, I can't call them communes, but it's like they're aggregated and pushed in these forms of radically artificial kinds of social existence, and they're treated purely in a collective way. And their labor is, Marx is showing how labor, at its most fundamental, when it's exploited, is exploited socially and on a collective level, right? And in order to alienate people from their means of production, they need to be kind of herded into plantations and other forms of confined and enclosed existence. So it's very ironic from the if you juxtapose that to the kind of the prejudices and the delusions of thinkers of British classical political economy. Now, another thing that I think is significant here, though, is that, and I'm adding something to Marx myself, so you'll have to forgive me for that. But the thing that Marx is talking about with primitive accumulation has a clear history, and actually Marx and Engels would probably agree with this, in the whole development of private property, which they identify in all of their Eurocentrism. But as a kind of Asiatic Mongol warlord, I agree with them, by the way. They trace that the beginning is ancient Greece with the rise of slave society, then feudalism and so on, and you know how the story goes. But this isn't just because of Eurocentrism, because actually, even in the beginning of what we call, private property and coinage and money, I mean, the history of coinage is a little complicated, but it's definitely associated with Greek antiquity. It's the same thing. It's this kind of, you have to describe it in terms of all manner of craven villainy and greed and avarice and all of this kinds of base. He talks about the base kinds of, the crudest of human instincts or whatever. This was also what was necessary for the kind of post-Bronze Age emergence of the Greek city-states, which were also characterized in their foundation with piracy, right? Not a lot of people know this, but piracy formed the foundation of Greek antiquity. And if you read this in the Homeric poems, it's clear and so on. Then after, with the rise of feudalism, this is also clear, right? Feudalism also was a kind of state of war that formed after the collapse of the Roman Empire, right? So in all of these cases of the emergence of private property, the common denominator is a type of violence, a specific type of historical and social violence, which alienated people from their conventions, from what they were used to, and from this otherwise undisrupted pattern, more kind of social existence. Sorry for rambling, but
No, it's great.
I would add, before we get there, let's have common definitions here. How would you define primitive accumulation from your reading, your understanding?
I would say the process of enclosure, the divorcing of people from their land and means of production, and therefore the divorcing of them from the ability to produce their own means of subsistence, so they're forced to then sell their labor in a market. Like in the U.S., it would be the process of what's called settler colonialism, because the indigenous people had their own mode of production, and that had to be wiped out, and once that's wiped out, they are forced to be wage laborers.
So it's a good definition. The question now is, where does primitive accumulation come into the history of class formation? Would you locate it at what would we consider primitive societies or slave societies, or where would you see it on the continuum of the history?
That's where I get a little confused, because I don't know if he is putting a timeline on it, or is he just saying it's over this vast period of time through genocide, pillage, slavery, robbery. This is how the capitalists gain their wealth. Well, they tell us that they did it through their industriousness and frugality.
Rightfully so, and I think that this is one of the issues that comes into play within Marxist theory, because Marx himself is not only a philosopher, but really doing what we consider to be sociology now, right? However, he's not necessarily a historian in the historiographic understanding of it. Now, with our understanding of how Marxist historians understand history, and I'll give you here an example. For example, as Haz was saying, the British theorist like Locke in his second treatise, what does he say? He says man cultivates the earth, and through that cultivation, the land is his. Well, wait a minute. Where did this come from? How did this just come out of nowhere? Because historically speaking, nowhere has that happened in an idealist sense ever. Man cultivated, man and woman of course, cultivated the land, right? But the land itself had no sense of belonging until the moment social structures were built to where somebody with more power and authority said, the land is mine. The land's mine. You cultivate it for me. Or small groups then said we cultivate it together in unison. However, they competed with other groups, right? This is the classic anthropological studies in Africa, for example, or in Oceania, where you're looking at different rival tribes and how they communicate with one another, their marriage ceremonies, and then of course their economic competition with one another, and how they're able to mediate that. I come here to an interesting point, and I actually just taught this lesson for my US history class. History, understanding of history from a Marxist lens, right, is a little bit uneven. We might think of it as a progression evenly throughout the world, but it's not that way. For example, I posed a very interesting question. My students had their minds blown this past week. Is American history, the indigenous people I'm speaking about, 14,000 years ago, is American history, or is it something else? What do you think?
It's not. It's not the history about America, because America formed with the Wasp people, so the indigenous people was before.
Correct. I'm asking the indigenous people.
Yeah.
Is there a unique indigenous American experience?
No.
Or what would you say?
It was different for all the different indigenous societies.
Correct. But did they bring a form with that?
Of
Sometimes they-
existence of their own mode of production.
Not only their own mode of production, their own cosmology, their own set of rituals, their own set of social belonging and social cohesion. Where did that come from? The reason why I ask this is that my students have an idea, I think most people around the world have this idea that somehow indigenous people, like through parthenogenesis, emerged from the land. But where did they come from?
Migrated.
From where?
Other places.
Correct.
Through the land bridge.
Correct. So you could make an argument, and I argue this as a historian, that the indigenous history of this hemisphere is a continuation of Asian history. And you know who else argues that? The very famous Chinese professor from Harvard University who published an amazing chapter in the Peabody Press over the Peabody Museum of Anthropology, who argues for what's called a China-Maya continuum. that the people of the Americas brought with them 14,000 years ago to 20,000 years ago over the land bridge. They brought with them the social and cosmological structures of Asian societies. So that simultaneously, as China was rising, the Aztecs, the Maya, the Inca, and the indigenous people had a similar cosmology to them. And it was a highly stratified society where language was centralized to the religious class, where society had a certain form. However, he says, something unique happened in Mesopotamia. A breakout emerged. Something new and dynamic emerged there. And through that process, it transformed the world, eventually leading to the contact once more between East and West, the uniting of the two, right? And so my students were blown away by this because they said, if you think about American history, it starts from point A and goes on. But nobody ever looks at, these people came, but they came with their own forms and structures. That indigenous society didn't just come out of nowhere. And so in this, we can think about the Asian mode of production. Was there already a primitive Asian mode of production? Was there already different forms? So when you look at the primitive accumulation, when you think about the idea of class society forming, you have very interesting phenomena that emerge when the colonial powers come to this hemisphere, and all of a sudden indigenous people, for example, experience money for the first time, right? There's a very famous anthropological study about how indigenous people baptized money because they didn't know how money reproduced itself, right? There's very interesting ideas, right, throughout the experience of indigenous people and their contact with capitalist societies, with proto-capital, with mercantilists, right, the beginning of capitalism from Italian city-states onwards, as world systems theorists think. But the reason why I say this is that primitive accumulation happens unevenly, and it happens in different historical contexts at different points. And so really, what Haz was speaking about, the emergence of the capitalist system has actually, in a way, violently put us all unified together under the same experience. The first time in history, really, that all humans living in a capitalist world economy have a similar experience, socially speaking. Never before has this happened before to this extent. Certainly under imperial systems, the Mongols, the Romans, and others, the British, they tried to impose their will. But economically speaking, this capitalist system has done this violently to us, but also, as Marx says, has sowed the seeds of its own destruction. Why? Because now that we share this experience in a totalizing sense, we now have the weapons to unify together to overcome it. And so, I think it's important when thinking about primitive accumulation, class society, historically speaking, to really do the analysis and to go in deep, and I think Michael Hudson does, I think some people are doing great work in this field, history of coinage, history like this. But I think it's fascinating when you begin to look at it because it challenges prejudices that are common on different political spectrums in this country. That somehow people who were here, indigenous people, had keys to some type of utopia. They didn't. They themselves were products of their own social formation going back to the first early human populations before the land bridge. And by understanding that, you understand more robustly the history of class society, of class history, and you can understand how we got to today and how we can move to tomorrow.
Brilliant. Thank you.
I have a question that I've asked in a number of other places and I never seem to get something. I wonder what you guys have to say on this, but you know, we are all here, you know, at different levels and at different sort of ways of engaging, but with the hope that Marxism sort of is going to win the day, right? Like we are going to eventually land into this place where we can start building a Marxist society. But of course the capitalists are going to fight back and they're going to fight really, really hard. So, you know, I am Chilean, you know, I can tell you what they did to my country. We're still destroyed as a society, and what they did is unspeakable. And you see it all over the world. So, of course, you talk for instance about, like, you know, at some point we need to cease sort of the means of production. That's the dream, right? But when they fight back, the violence unleashed upon us is going to be probably like nothing ever seen before. And those of us with children, or with our families, I personally stay up at night thinking about that. And I guess the question is, so how do we prepare for that? What do we do? What other external forces we have to seek help? And how do we all collectively sort of like put our minds that, yes, we build this collective project together, but they're gonna come at us so freaking hard that it's gonna be really ugly, and we have to be there, present in that experience.
Well, one thing I didn't strongly emphasize enough is that, luckily for us, conveniently I guess, we are speaking in a context where the American global system is breaking down and is falling upon the kind of sword of its own internal contradictions. And because our society has become so increasingly dependent on these kinds of supply chains that are not domestic, and the organization of our society has become so alienated from the land upon which it exists, with the acceleration of the internal political contradictions of the United States, I mean, whose content I think speaks for itself, we're going to be looking at situations. I mean, you could put this in the context of new kind of ecological problems and new challenges the system is simply not going to be able to address. We're probably headed towards some kind of breakdown of normal life in this country as we know it. And we got a small taste of that with COVID. Now, people underestimate the significance of COVID in my view because it really reveals to what extent is a society functional. China had COVID. It started there. Look at how organized they were. Look at their ability to respond to it with such efficacy and efficiency and so on and so on. It was so seamless. Volunteers at the lowest levels of society, people helping the mutual aid, all of this, I hate that word though, all of this stuff was just kind of happening in a logical and rational way because it's in the nature of their civilization, their culture. Meanwhile, the U.S., toilet paper's all gone and it's a disaster, and people are just kind of pushing each other to go to Walmart and grab everything off the shelves. It's a really big disaster here. And then we all kind of came to our socialism through Uber Eats, I guess. We all had that solidarity together. But, but in all seriousness, we're not a functional society. We are kind of, I don't want to say it, but as a country, we're kind of a parasitic country. We've assimilated supply chains around the world that are alienated from our own production, our own labor, and we are kind of passive consumers subsisting off of debt, and that's it. The NEET is the new kind of post-COVID American subject. This person who's just living off of debt. Who cares if they have bad credit, whatever? But it's not sustainable, And there's going to come a point where something like a society is going to have to be built, Some kinds of networks of, please don't shoot me, but mutual aid. Something like that will have to emerge, to fill the vacuum. There's going to be a strong vacuum in terms of disruptions in everyday life. Okay, I'm kind of going a little crazy. So what can we do now to prepare for these kinds of... And by the way, that's a circumstance of violence and chaos and warlords and gangs and all this. This is what we should anticipate. So what should we do now? Well, square one is we need to create sustainable is the key word, forms of organization, forms of communication. But organization is the most important one. If, excuse my French, but if something hits the fan, I haven't thought of it, something hits the fan, then we're going to need to be there to fill vacuums and to be able to organize. The most organized groups, the most organized people are going to be able to survive in the America that's to come. That much we can guarantee. Now, for now, should we go live in the woods or something and live on a ranch together? I mean, no thank you. But what we can,
you're always welcome.
With all due respect, I mean, it's just like, I'm not proposing a fucking,
I'm live streaming.
I'm not proposing a cult. Okay?
I have the same.
Yeah. Sorry.
Asking the question.
I'm not proposing a cult. I'm just saying we need to have we need to create organized forms of existence which are simultaneously modern, which simultaneously account for and respect for not only our privacy, but how disparate we are geographically, and that there is a degree to which separation isn't a bad thing. Separation also gives us different perspectives. It gives us different insights. It gives us room to experiment, right? This is a kind of a foundation of the ethic of the American Communist Party. Is we want to promote experimentation. We don't want to prescribe collective forms of existence to people. We want people to figure out how they can get along and organize with each other and acquire an existence on that basis in order to lay the foundations to prepare. I'm not here to sell you an illusion. We will never win a presidential election, ever. It's never going to happen. I hope I'm wrong. I'm a finite person. I could be wrong. I don't think it's going to happen.
No Chavez.
Sorry?
No Chavez, like presidents.
No, we will never be elected. It would never be allowed to happen. Now, does that mean I'm saying, we should be crazy? And no. Just to exist as organized communists who are socially responsive and responsible and are leaders of their communities and are offering Americans some kind of paradigm of association that works, right? That is what's enough for now. And it's about preparation. It's about anticipating realistically what we're headed for.